Good afternoon, everyone. Today's argument is severe. The most dangerous war in the Middle East is not only the war of missiles, airstrikes, oil, and military bases. It is the war that turns water into a weapon. The war that exposes how modern states can survive damage to prestige, survive damage to rhetoric, and even survive damage to military equipment, but struggle to survive when access to water becomes unstable, politicized, and vulnerable to attack. That is the scenario we are examining today. This presentation argues that if a full-scale war erupts between the United States, Israel, and Iran, one of the most brutal and least openly discussed fronts would be the struggle over water systems. Not because water replaces oil, but because water sits beneath everything else. Oil funds states. Water keeps them alive. Oil powers economies. Water sustains cities. Oil drives strategy. Water determines endurance. And once water systems become part of the battlefield, the war stops being just a contest of military force. It becomes a contest over whether entire populations can continue daily life without panic, collapse, or displacement. That is the real danger. So let us start with the first principle. Modern states do not merely possess water. They depend on systems that deliver it. Pipes, power grids, pumping stations, treatment plants, reservoirs, desalination infrastructure, dams, distribution networks, transport routes, engineering teams, and stable electricity. All of that must function continuously. Water is not just a natural resource sitting peacefully in the background. In many regions, especially in the Middle East, water is manufactured, managed, rationed, and politically protected. That means war does not have to seize every city to threaten survival. It only has to pressure the systems that make those cities livable. That is why this scenario is so dangerous. The Gulf states, in particular, have built extraordinary urban wealth in an environment that does not naturally support that scale of population and consumption. Much of that survival rests on desalination, imported technology, uninterrupted energy, and stable infrastructure. In plain terms, many of the richest cities in the region are not rich because geography is kind to them. They are rich because technology has temporarily beaten geography. War can reverse that illusion very quickly. If desalination plants come under pressure, if power systems become unstable, if maintenance chains are interrupted, if ports slow down, if technicians leave, if emergency repairs become difficult, then the problem is no longer abstract. The problem becomes immediate. Can the city continue to provide drinkable water at scale? And once that question starts hanging over a city, fear does the rest, because people will tolerate political tension longer than they will tolerate uncertainty about water. That is the second major argument of this presentation. Water panic is politically faster than ideology. It moves through a population with brutal speed. Investors can wait on speeches. Families cannot wait on water. Governments can manage anger for a while. They struggle to manage the psychological effect of a population that starts wondering whether essential services are at risk. Now, let us turn to Iran, because this is where the scenario becomes even sharper. Iran is not immune to water vulnerability. Far from it. It faces drought pressure, shrinking lakes, stressed rivers, agricultural strain, and deep long-term environmental stress. That means Iran enters this kind of war with a dangerous weakness already embedded inside its national system. And that matters because in a major escalation, an enemy does not always aim first at what looks strongest. Sometimes it aims at what is already under pressure. It amplifies what is weak. It takes a structural problem and turns it into a strategic liability. That is exactly what makes water so central in this scenario. If the United States and Israel believe Iran cannot be broken quickly through leadership strikes or conventional air pressure alone, then the temptation grows to intensify pressure against the systems that support civilian continuity. Not necessarily through dramatic public declarations, but through infrastructure strain, repeated disruption, and attacks on the broader environment of survival. Why? Because a state can absorb military losses and continue fighting. It is far harder to absorb mass civilian desperation without political consequences. That is the ugly logic. Once reservoirs, treatment systems, pumping networks, or energy links that support water delivery come under pressure, the state is forced to divert attention. It is no longer focused only on retaliating militarily. It is managing internal stability, urban fear, public anger, rural breakdown, and the possibility that ordinary hardship turns into political crisis. In other words, the battlefield expands from the front line into the plumbing of national survival. That is what makes this war more dangerous than a conventional military showdown. Now let us step back and look at the regional balance. The Gulf and Iran are both vulnerable, but in different ways. The Gulf is wealthy, centralized, urbanized, and highly dependent on exposed infrastructure. It can produce water through technology, but that technology depends on stability. Iran has more territorial depth, more population spread, and more geographic complexity, but it carries severe internal water stress of its own. So both sides in this scenario sit on different forms of fragility. That is why water becomes such a terrifying equalizer. It punishes glamour, it punishes concentration, it punishes overdependence, it punishes environmental weakness, and most of all, it punishes the fantasy that a modern war can remain neatly military when civilian survival systems are this exposed. This is where the strategic logic turns vicious. If Iran cannot match the United States plane for plane, it can still impose fear by threatening desalination, power, and urban continuity in the Gulf. If the United States and Israel cannot quickly collapse Iran politically, they may be drawn towards strategies that intensify internal stress around drought, infrastructure, and distribution systems. Neither side has to openly announce a water war for the region to start experiencing one. That is how modern escalation often works. Not through one dramatic statement, but through repeated attacks on systems nobody can afford to lose. And once those systems come under pressure, the consequences are much larger than the immediate target. Now let us talk about cities. Modern cities are incredibly strong in appearance and incredibly fragile in structure. They look permanent, they look self-sustaining, they look like monuments of steel, glass, finance, and engineering. But strip away water continuity and the illusion collapses with astonishing speed. Hospitals suffer, housing systems strain, cooling systems become unstable, sanitation falters, public confidence breaks, rumors spread faster than facts, government messaging loses credibility, and suddenly the issue is no longer whether the city is rich, the issue is whether the city is governable. That is the third major argument of this presentation. When water is threatened, governance itself is threatened, because governments can survive criticism, they can survive protests, they can survive market volatility, but when they appear unable to protect the basic systems of life, their legitimacy starts to bleed much faster. This is especially dangerous for Gulf governments, which have built much of their political model on competence, order, and the promise of uninterrupted modern life. Their strength is not based only on ideology, it is based on performance. They offer stability, efficiency, comfort, and predictability. That bargain works until the underlying systems of that comfort begin to shake, then performance becomes exposure. And once exposure becomes visible, the political cost rises quickly. Now let us move to the global dimension, because this is not only about regional suffering, it is also about how the world reacts when water pressure destabilizes energy-producing states. If Gulf cities are under stress, energy markets do not remain calm. If labor flows are disrupted, logistics do not remain calm. If urban systems appear vulnerable, investors do not remain calm. If governments have to spend heavily on emergency continuity, financial priorities shift. And once all of that happens at the same time, the war begins producing a second-order effect. Water instability starts feeding economic instability. That is the hidden chain reaction. A strike on water infrastructure is not merely a humanitarian issue. It is an economic issue, a political issue, an insurance issue, a migration issue, a labor issue, a market issue, because modern systems are layered. Damage one layer and the shock moves outward. This is also why outside powers begin paying closer attention. Europe may talk first about energy and trade, but if water stress starts destabilizing Gulf states or intensifying internal crisis in Iran, then the fear becomes broader, disorder spreads, regional panic grows, the probability of displacement increases. Governments start imagining not just temporary disruption, but prolonged instability. That is when the war becomes harder to contain. Now let us examine the American side more closely. The United States can defend bases, move carriers, intercept missiles, and launch precision strikes. But this scenario exposes a limitation of military power. Even overwhelming force is not always good at restoring civilian continuity. Once essential infrastructure becomes a battlefield, you can destroy launch sites, you can threaten retaliation, you can demonstrate superiority. But can you guarantee stable water delivery across vulnerable urban zones in an active war? That is a different question. And it is a much more uncomfortable question because it reveals the gap between military dominance and political control. A superpower can dominate the sky and still fail to reassure populations living under infrastructure anxiety. It can win exchanges of force and still lose the larger contest over public confidence. That is how strong powers find themselves trapped. They discover too late that there is no easy military solution to a war that is being fought through systems of dependence. Now, consider the psychological effect. Missile alerts create fear, but water insecurity creates dread. Why? Because missile alerts are episodic. Water insecurity is continuous. It enters the kitchen, the hospital, the school, the apartment tower, the workplace, the neighborhood. It changes daily behavior. It widens the war from specific moments into constant background anxiety. That is what makes it so politically corrosive. Once a population starts measuring war not only by explosions, but by whether ordinary life is still sustainable, the entire emotional register of the conflict changes. War becomes intimate, it becomes domestic, it becomes impossible to keep at a rhetorical distance. And when that happens, escalation becomes harder to manage because the public stops seeing the conflict as something happening at the border. It sees it in the most basic condition of life itself. Now step back and look at the larger lesson. For decades, the Middle East has been described through the language of oil wealth, oil roots, oil shocks, oil politics. But this scenario argues that the next truly dangerous war in the region may reveal something even more fundamental. Oil explains power, but water explains endurance. A state can lose money and still fight. A state can lose prestige and still fight. A state can lose equipment and still fight. But a state that cannot protect water continuity faces a much more serious test because it is no longer asking its people merely to support a war. It is asking them to survive one in the most immediate possible sense. That is a far more dangerous political demand. So what is the final conclusion? It is this. The war that turns water into a weapon is not simply cruel. It is structurally destabilizing. It attacks the hidden systems that allow rich cities to function, fragile states to endure, and governments to claim competence. It exposes environmental weakness as strategic weakness. It reveals that infrastructure can be more decisive than rhetoric. And it proves that once essential survival systems enter the battlefield, even powerful states begin looking much more brittle than they did before the war started. That is the nightmare. A war where desalination plants matter as much as air bases. A war where reservoirs matter as much as runways. A war where civilian continuity becomes the real front line. A war where victory is no longer measured only in military terms, but in which society can keep functioning longer under pressure. And once that kind of war begins, the region is no longer fighting only over territory, prestige, or deterrence. It is fighting over the conditions of life itself. Thank you.